Hello, my name is Todd Lassiter, and I want to welcome you to our new podcast, The Workforce That Supports the Workforce. And I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been in the childcare industry for the past 25 years. I'm the owner and operator of Shepherd's Way Day School. We have a location in Asheboro and another one here in Colfax. And today I'm joined by Ashley Allen, and she's with the Equip Project, and I'll let her talk a little bit about herself.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out which hat to describe first. I do work with Equipped. We are housed at UNCG and funded by Smart Start. We are in Guilford County, and we work with licensed centers and homes on all things technical assistance. So professional development, coaching in the classrooms. My work is around work environment, which is pretty unique, which addresses all things adult. So policies, communication practices, compensation, basically the climate of what it feels like to come to work. Because we know if teachers are not well, they can't be well for children. I also teach in a couple of different places, higher ed for early childhood coursework, and I'm also on the board with the North Carolina Institute of Early Child Development Professionals, NCICDP. It's a volunteer organization, but it pulls together a lot of folks across the state who we just work towards the mission of connecting education and compensation. And we do that through projects, advocacy, you name it.
Well, thank you for joining us this is on our very first podcast. And the purpose of our new podcast, The Workforce That Supports the Workforce, is to talk about current issues in childcare. And the reason we named it this is it really is a workforce that supports the workforce in North Carolina. Without the childcare industry, there is no business in North Carolina. And what we'd like to do on our podcast is talk about the issues that affect childcare and in the long term also affect the overall health of the economy in North Carolina, directly and indirectly. And so we have something coming up in June. We had, during the pandemic, we were able to stabilize the childcare industry in North Carolina with some grants that I'm going to let Ashley talk a little bit about. And then we're going to talk about the status of those grants as we're getting into the new fiscal year.
Yeah, so try to give the short, clear version of how this played out. But when COVID hit, we quickly realized that without having somewhere for young children to go, that we had certain folks with certain jobs that weren't able to continue doing those jobs. And when we realized that, a lot of places ended up, it was kind of this tricky phase. We had some programs that closed temporarily just because of health concerns, safety, and really people not knowing what this was all about. But even before any grant funding, programs did begin to open back up because we realized even healthcare workers, grocery stores, that kind of stable piece of the economy of everyday living and health and safety couldn't just stop. And for anyone holding those jobs with young children, this idea of childcare really became essential. And I think that's something to come back to, is this idea of childcare versus education and competing demands of the two, because they're not really the same thing. But in that moment, childcare became essential because we needed somewhere to take a young child if you have a job that your child can't go with you. Go back out, big picture, national level, we had lots of ARPA dollars come down to the state level with the intention of putting these dollars into early childhood and helping these programs stay open. As that happened, North Carolina chose to use their dollars to, I guess, what we would call originally stabilization grants. And it was a two-part component to that. So a piece of it was for operational dollars, so things like just paying your rent and bills. The other portion of that was to incentivize compensation for early educators or people on the ground, literally doing the work. And programs were given some choice of how to use those dollars. They could submit a salary scale and use some of that towards increasing teachers' wages, which on average ended up being about $3 an hour for programs that did that. or they could do bonuses. And I think to the average person listening, oh, $3 an hour may not sound like that much. But when we look at data from 2019 that has our average early childhood teacher wage in North Carolina around $10.92, a $3 an hour raise is, 30% of what you're earning. So if I asked you, Todd, share what you make, and if you got a 30% salary increase, how would that make you feel?
That's significant,
right?
It is.
So in that case, it is a pretty big chunk. So fast forward as these grants begin to trickle down, because money that is not replenished eventually will disappear. We are at that point where it is end of April, exactly today, but we've got a little over a month and a half-ish before the end of these grants run out. And what that means for most programs is that teachers who have been earning this extra money per hour or bonuses will no longer be seeing that. So it's kind of an icing on the cake for an already really fragile system. Because I think another thing that COVID highlighted is, prior to COVID, if you look at the standard of living, and this is just being specific to Guilford County, it wasn't too far off, maybe $5-7 from what a median wage might look like for early childhood teachers, which means for those who have a second income in the home, still living with family, or even having, I hate to say this, but it's true, some federal government supports, WIC, things like that, there was enough wiggle room that there were more people who could afford to be an early childhood teacher. Fast forward to 24 with inflation, you can look at MIT's living wages online, and they break it down even to county. We're at a place where we probably need to have, if you have a $15 an hour job, about 3 of those in your household to be able to survive. So what that means for the workforce of early childhood educators is that it literally wiped out those that could afford to work in that role before COVID, but inflation has kind of knocked out a huge chunk of the teachers who now really can't make that work anymore. So I feel like we're really kind of looking at this twofold issue where inflation has knocked out a chunk of our workforce and programs are already short-staffed, doing what they can to keep the staff they have, but we're also on the edge of trying to figure out how do we keep wages where they are without putting the burden on families. And I guess that points us to the last solution, which is to advocate again for public funding.
Yeah, and even with the $3 an hour that we've had with the stabilization grant, we're still competing against the likes of Costco and Target. They're $17 an hour in North Carolina. Verizon, they're paying $20 an hour in North Carolina. So we're competing with box stores and other retailers, and they're able to pay more than we're able to in childcare, because the only way that we can make up that difference is to increase tuition.
Yeah,
and it's very expensive for families.
And I think it's really highlighting what we've called for a while the trilemma of early childhood, which is balancing that 3-legged stool of quality, affordability, and accessibility. And honestly, the only reason programs are maintaining where they are now, a lot of folks go into early childhood thinking that it's a really profitable business model because you see the tuition cost and you think, oh, they have to be making a lot, right? They just don't pay their teachers well. When in reality, the only reason programs are maintaining the doors staying open is through sacrificing certain elements of quality. And one of those continues to be that we have to stay open, we stay open because there are groups of people who are willing to do this work and sacrifice themselves for a lower wage because of their education, their belief in the importance of early childhood. They get it. They know the research. They know that there's a return on investment. They know that 0 to 3 is the most critical time for brain development and language and social emotional development. And they stay because of those things. But what we're doing is essentially remaining open and allowing other people to bring their children into this environment, go off to work, and do that by being willing to take a lower wage. And there's other elements of quality that get sacrificed too. I mean, even in your program and working with them, I know there's things that they would love to do as far as the outdoor environment, more things in the classrooms, more teachers, because we know that even though there's legal ratios to meet, the more adults you have in a space, the more one-on-one interaction children are going to get. But they can't do that because tuition would have to increase. And if that's going to be on the backs of families, that's not something ethically that I think much of the field is willing to do.
Yeah, and the tuition is already high, but in childcare, the margins are very low, in the single digits. So you would think the margins are high because the tuition is so high, but it's not. And it's, there's a lot of things that makes it expensive. It's very labor intensive, teaching labor. And then you have your brick and mortar costs. You have all of the other costs associated with operating a school, and it becomes more and more expensive as inflation increases. And as we're heading towards this cliff where the funding is about to run out, there's very few solutions other than continued government funding or a substantial tuition increase, and that's what we're looking at. Not just my schools, but all of us that operate child care centers in North Carolina, looking at between a 20 and 30% increase in tuition immediately if this funding does not come through.
Yeah, and I think what's important to think about with that is, you and I were discussing this earlier, there's always going to be a group of people that can afford a tuition increase. What that doesn't account for is that the tuition for the majority of families already is more than it should be. We've had research and policies that have been proposed that say, if you look at the big picture of a family's budget, 7% of their income should be the max that would be allocated towards something like early childhood, child care. As it stands, it's typically anywhere from 10 to 30% of a family's entire budget that could be put towards the child care costs. So with that as it is, I think it's going to eliminate a lot of families, and we're already starting to see this. If you're online, or I just like to be on Facebook, especially because you're seeing families talk about it. There's a lot of people seeking care from the neighbor, from a friend down the street, or someone posting that, hey, I have my grandchild here too. I'm okay taking 2 or 3 more children. So now we're seeing this kind of shaping of culture and society to match the needs of working families instead of kind of infrastructure stepping in to build and maintain that stability that families already have and make it grow. So I think we're going to continue seeing that if this doesn't end up having a solution work itself out. There's a lot of people that are not going to be able to afford childcare. And I think the flip side of that is that for those who can, that's great for you. But if you're an employer, what about your coworker? I think it's going to cause a lot of disruption for people outside of their own safety circle, so to speak, if they're not realizing kind of the larger impacts that this could have economically and socially.
Yeah, and if children are going to neighbors' homes for early childhood education, they're going to be losing a crucial part of the quality of early childhood education, because we have educated teachers who have a heart for this, and this is what they want to do with a career. And as you know, you mentioned it, what happens between 0 and 3 impacts the child for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And not to negate family care, I want to be distinct too in saying that I'm not referring to our licensed family child care homes, because they provide such a great foundational piece for children in our community too. But when we talk about like unlicensed, unregulated spaces, it's not to negate or make it sound as if bad things happen there, but it looks back at this idea of someone just needing childcare.
More like a
And-
babysitter. Right?
And I'll say this too, because I don't want to come across as if I'm labeling anyone in any position. But here's the distinction that I'll make is I can't guarantee what that setting is going to look like, but what I can guarantee is that we've got some standards in place as far as our license programs go that are intended to make sure the majority of families have access to a teacher who's familiar with developmental screenings, looking out for a developmental delay, planning based on children's individual needs, emergent curriculum. So I think we've done a really good job where most of the public understands that children learn through play. But what all that accomplishes, though, is thinking that if your child is playing, they're learning. I think where we have missed kind of that mark in marketing, public education around what quality early childhood environments do is that play is intentional. In the sense, there's a difference between picking up your child and hearing, Joe played in the sandbox today. Awesome, he had a good time, he was playing, cool. Joe played in the sandbox today. We had some different size cups and we worked on volume and mass. Whoa, like as the parent of a 4-year-old, I've had both of, well, she's not 4 now, but back in the day, as the parent of a 4-year-old, I've had both of those experiences picking up my daughter. And I will tell you, from the parent perspective, it sounds a whole lot different.
Yes.
And even the way that was explained to me would say, well, I want my child in that place because she's coming home talking about volume and mass. This child might have too. But if I'm not telling you that that's what we mean by play, you're coming out with this misconception that play is learning. Play can happen as long as they're in a place where they are playing while I'm at work. And I think that's a big disconnect because at the end of the day, play is important. But intentional play, where you've got an educator there to prompt with questions and push their thinking and use that language, you have a 5-year-old going into kindergarten who's already making those connections of things that teachers are talking about versus I've played, I know how to kind of get along with others, whatever they've been exposed to, but it's very different when you're missing that intentional teacher who's got the background, the education, and the understanding of brain development in young children.
And we understand that, and we have a lot of our children who are already reading before they even get to kindergarten.
Yeah, and
because of the skills of these teachers.
Yeah, and we get it. And I do think, though, that that's part of the issue as far as the public perception of the work is that we've advocated play is important and people get that, but play doesn't seem like much more than bouncing balls around and playing duck, duck, goose, unless we explain what we mean by play, what kind of play, what's happening, who's in the environment. Those are the important pieces. And I think that's another place that our programs are struggling right now too. Because prior to COVID, when you are closer to being fully staffed, you can be much closer to that place of intentional play with children. But when you're having these staffing issues, if you've lost a lot of people because they can't afford to take the job anymore, you're in a place where you're trying to meet the needs of the family by providing childcare. That typically means 10 to 12-hour days. But you want to be educational, which takes a lot more intentionality, time, dedication, and it is so difficult to do when you're short-staffed and with those hours. So I think programs are really struggling too to want to meet the needs of families by being there as a support for them to work, but they're also being forced to kind of work with their values and make sacrifices because you can't do all of the educational play things when you don't have the staff and stability in the program that you once had.
And let's talk a little bit about the shortage of staff, because I see that as the other major, these are the two major issues, and that all centers in North Carolina are having the same problem with recruiting and with retention of qualified staff, because
Right.
we have a very specific skill set, and these people are becoming harder and harder to find and harder to keep. And can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure.
Okay.
I giggle because this is kind of this is my space, so to speak. I would say that I am a social researcher that kind of blends organizational climate with early childhood, which is kind of unique. There's a lot of reasons that people in any industry stay in a job. Compensation and benefits are one of them, but work environment is another. And I kind of say those are the two big buckets to keep in mind, would be compensation and benefits, and what is it like to come to work. We kind of know a little bit of the story with the compensation piece, that we already have this big pool of folks who have been eliminated with COVID and inflation because they can no longer make that an affordable choice. So we'll go ahead and throw that section of teachers out. They jumped, they left for that reason. Well, you now have benefits. So let's say they can still make the compensation piece work. What I'm seeing probably in the past year or so is more and more younger teachers who are in that phase of where they can make the pay work, start to see what else is available with that degree, where they can suddenly have health insurance and pay goes up. So we've got this big piece around benefits as they age out of parent plans, graduate college, that sort of thing, where the benefits and healthcare access are becoming extremely important. We also know, though, that health and physical well-being are attached to financial well-being, the way that our economy is set up. So if you don't have one, it's hard to access the other. So the benefits are now having a really big impact as far as turnover that I've seen locally in the past year or so. I think the last piece to think about is that compensation and benefits were already important. They're more important now, but the work environment is even more important now, because for those that can make it affordable, don't need the health insurance, or either for whatever reason have access to that through family, spouse, whatever, what you have left is how it feels to come to work, what you are asked to do. A sense of belonging in the space is very important. Psychological well-being and feeling psychological safety is known in research as being one of the most important indicators as to how long someone stays in a role. And what we mean by that is, am I trusted? Am I respected? And we're already talking about a job where, because of ratios and legal aspects, you have to ask to go to the bathroom most of the time. So think about a lot of the pieces of autonomy are already kind of reined back in a little, but then add to that maybe an administrator who moves teachers into different spaces without letting them know, because you're short-staffed, someone calls out, you lost your day, you asked off because only one person cannot be here on that day. You have a sick relative, a mother maybe that you're taking care of, family things. All of that can be jeopardized in a moment when you are running on the thin line of staffing. Then you've also got pieces of administrators who are more do as I say, not as I do it because I said so. Pieces around transparency, building trust, ownership. And I get it in this field, especially with compensation. This is a good example. A lot of times programs need someone really, really bad. You have a teacher come in and apply, and you really need them in that position. So you offer a little bit more than what maybe some of your other staff are paid because you need them in there. But what happens in that moment is you've now created this kind of skewed system with wage compression, where you've got a teacher who may have been there 5 years and is fabulous, but they're making like $1 less than what this new hire is now making. And then you look at the big picture and you can't really give a raise because you see where this is going, but you can't talk about it, because if you talk about it, you're focusing on it. And then if you focus on it, then people are going to know what you had to do to get people in the program. And that's not going to make staff feel good about themselves or their job or why they're here. And then it looks like I'm lying. And then, so you see how this can turn into a spiral of secrecy, really, in early childhood programs. So it's almost like we're doing our best to get better, but sometimes shooting ourselves in the foot by some of the practices because it's not giving us the space to take ownership and be able to change the way that we've done things to ever see how it could be done differently. That was a whole lot of an answer to your question, but all that to say, it's a really tricky field when it comes to work environments and creating a space where staff feel like they can take ownership in their classroom. They know that if they ask off for their mother's surgery, that they will be able to be there. I mean, otherwise that choice sometimes comes down to, well, I'm not coming in. Okay, well, it's North Carolina. You don't have a job. So it's a really tricky space, and it's different for every program.
Do you think that we're getting more potential teachers going into the field, or do you think that is a part of the problem?
I think I can't answer that for sure. So let me be clear in saying this is just my observation from the spaces that I'm in. I feel like the numbers are declining for teachers enrolling in early childhood programs. But I also think there are a lot of teachers who are let's say for the ones that are enrolled and get to that point of saying, I want to do my BK license. I want to be a licensed teacher. They get to this point in their 4-year degree process and go into that practicum experience in a public school, kindergarten, or pre-K classroom, and they get snatched up immediately. Many of our practicum students are getting a job offer from the public school system on the spot because they're seeing a lot of the same things as far as teacher shortage and turnover. So I think if we could be more intentional in working with our early childhood pre-service educators about where they're going and getting them in good environments that maybe kind of keep sustaining the private sector. Not that we don't need our NC pre-K teachers, because they're required to have a 4-year degree as well. But I think if we were more intentional about the spaces that we could have them in at that point in their career, just jumping off, we might be able, if we could incentivize some way to place them in, our smaller private settings.
We're not only competing against Target and Verizon, but we're also competing against the
very much so. And that's where a lot of the teachers who are leaving end up going, is public school system, or taking that step from private program to NC pre-K or your Head Start and early Head Start, because they do have more infrastructure from having state and federal funding streams, just depending on which one it's in.
Well, we know what the short-term issues are right now. What can be done in the short term, and thinking about the long term, what would that look like?
Well, I think if families think about the fact that, they've gotten tuition increases before. Best practice as a business is to have an increase annually, but not 30%. They've been through it before, and there's always that kind of, if families understood that a 30% increase, whether it is a major financial impact on your pocket or not, is not the choice of your program. They're not doing this voluntarily to say, let's, increase our revenue 30% this year. It's really to make up for another pot of funding that's disappearing that we could still have in place if we connect with legislators and let them know that this is important. I think that's one key element, is that if families understand that these increases, and for those who increase, there still might be programs that close. Research is showing for states that have already kind of had some of this going on, research for North Carolina that just came out too still says about 30% can close. The rest are a 30% increase.
That was the research that I've been reading too.
Yeah, I think if families understand that is one thing. I think we also tend to look at early educators, and I know I have in the past, and kind of felt like they have some ownership or reason to say, hey, I want to keep my pay. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's not their responsibility to be doing this, as much as I hope many of them, happen to listen to, that weren't aware of how all this played out. There's a lot of times that teachers are very disconnected from the big picture of things. Meaning, if you're hired at ABC Childcare and ABC says, well, we have this money and we're going to give you a bonus of $300 a month. That's great. Like, you still may, as a teacher, have no concept that these were ARPA dollars given to the division who trickled to your program, and your program owner has the option of doing this. So there's this kind of disconnect where they think, okay, well, now my owner at ABC decided to stop doing it. I don't like her anymore. And that's the end of it. Like, they didn't realize that there is another avenue, that you do have rights and responsibilities as far as citizenship goes, that you can get involved in order to say, hey, I need this, my colleagues need this, the families I care for need me to stay in my job. So I think that awareness, at least for teachers that may not understand that kind of chain of events of how things trickle down, is important. And then I also think, let's tell our families, go ahead and say, as we've discussed this too, Todd, as a business owner, let them know this is what we're thinking we have to do, but here are some people you can call in the meantime, and let them know that it's important. There's an event that's being coordinated on May 16th at the state legislature in Raleigh, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and you can find that probably all over the internet at this point, has pulled together a family-friendly event, and they're trying to involve early educators, families, and children, very much like Strolling Thunder, if you're familiar with that, that the Coalition and Think Babies have organized in the past in Raleigh, to really just raise the awareness to say, we might close today to be here, but we want to close for one day instead of possibly closing forever. And this is opinion, but the other side of this that I hope no one misses is, yes, we want our grants to continue for the programs. We would love for that to happen, but that's not the end solution.
That's a stopgap.
Yeah. It needs to be a both and. Continue funding so that we don't close, but commit to piloting some sort of different plan in the next year so that during that time, we're also working on a long-term solution. Because the next time inflation bumps us up as an economy at all, I think we're going to hit that tipping point even with a grant. Because there's only so far that inflation can go for the cost of living, and only so low that wage floor can go before that whole system just kind of collapses. Or, as we said, turns into the seriously have versus have not. And I still think that's an oversimplification because it's going to impact everyone.
Well, and the thing is, as we're looking at a 30% increase in July, we know that we can survive because our waiting list is it's more than our current enrollment. So we will lose some families, but we will immediately be able to fill those spots back in. But what does that mean for the families that can't stay?
Yeah, and it's already an inequitable system for many. We have waiting lists for subsidy. Subsidy does a lot, but then at the same time, it doesn't do a lot if you don't have an opening in a program. And your opening in a program is because they don't have enough staff. So I guess the more you increase tuition, there'll always be someone that can pay the tuition. When we're already focused on so many other issues around inequity in early childhood, this is probably one of the biggest issues that we would be causing ourselves that would make it even worse. But again, that's my 2 cents.
What now is for a long-term solution? Would it be possible to get to a point where, for benefits and compensation for early childhood workers and teachers, could be similar to what's going on with public school teachers?
I'm going to be the first person to say, people may listen to me and say this girl is crazy and living in utopia. But my response to anyone who says that is, well, has anything else that we've done worked? So I like to think outside the box. I like to just say, what if we tried that we hadn't tried yet? My short answer to you with that is yes, why not?
Is it being done elsewhere that you know of?
Well, the funny thing with early childhood is that there's so many different little pockets that are funded in different ways. The closest thing that we would have to that I would say is a comprehensive kind of system within itself would be looking at military bases and the childcare programs that exist in those spaces. But that doesn't really still answer your question. So what I would say though is Something I've thought about before is when we talk about teachers leaving for benefits, health insurance, so to speak, we think, oh my goodness, so just a little drop of data to make it make sense. We have about 2,200 people who work in early childhood programs in Guilford County. When you first hear, well, people leave for benefits, oh my gosh, we can't pay for 2,200 people to have health insurance. That's not what I said. So back up. The programs I work with, many people have health insurance or access to it. What we're talking about is maybe 2 to 4 out of a group of maybe 15 staff. You say, oh, well, that's not that big of a deal. They can figure out 2 to 4. But then you're talking about a third of staff turning over because of the lack of benefits. So when you say you have a staff of 15, 4 of that 15 is not good. You want to keep those 15. But if it's only 4, what would it look like to include them on our K-12 system benefits if that program were to meet some sort of criteria? Quid pro quo. You have a teacher in the public school system whose child gets to go there for free. You have one staff member who gets to be on benefits. Like, I don't know. There's got to be some sort of relationship that could benefit both sides. If you're having a hard time getting teachers in K-12, partner with a local program to give that childcare spot for the teacher as a hiring incentive, and then give that teacher benefits on the K-12 system. I know people will hear that and say, like, oh, there's no way, paperwork, whatever. Again, it's what we've done works. I don't know.
Now, you briefly mentioned what they're doing on military bases with childcare. What exactly, or how do they handle that?
Well, their biggest difference is funding.
Oh, okay.
Just to put that out there. So yeah, funding is important, but I think it really goes back to highlight this idea of what we call the true cost of quality. Is they're probably the closest thing to being able to fund it. And what I mean by that is tuition is one thing. It's a flat dollar amount. It does not fund the true cost of quality. The true cost is if I were to say, Todd, as an owner, what is everything that you know developmentally that infants need in the infant space? And you started making out that list. And I said, okay, so what are all the skills that you want that infant teacher to have? And you start making that list. And we say, well, all right, what does that teacher need to be paid? Not based on market value or what other programs are doing or what you can afford. What should that teacher be paid? What should that teacher's benefits look like? And we price all of that out. That's the true cost of quality. So what we're doing now is just sacrificing pieces of it to stay open and do the best we can. The true cost is a number that, I mean, you can use different calculators online and sit down and come up with that all day long, but military bases are the closest thing that comes to having the funding to get to
and
the true cost of
they have all
quality.
they need.
So it's a great model, but again, the secret sauce goes back to dollars.
Right. So do you have any other ideas of what we can do in the long term?
I think it would be awesome if, we're talking right now about revising the QRIS or Quality Rating Improvement Scale. Fancy words, but for folks listening in programs, just that whole thing of going through the assessment process and getting stars and being looked at for quote unquote quality levels through that lens. North Carolina is in a moment of talking about revising that. They've got some suggestions out there, but I think it's a critical time that we could also let folks know that why don't we include some form of compensation in that? So if programs meet some sort of criteria, let's fund the gap between a teacher's pay who has let's say you have a 4-year degree teacher. What is the gap between their pay now and what a K-12 salary scale? Because we have the model salary scale for early childhood educators in North Carolina. It just puts a 4-year degree teacher on parity with a K-12 teacher because we feel that why would you make less in my program than you would in the public school classroom? We have the same degree. So that's the premise behind that. But why can't we attach some sort of criteria to what quality looks like and figure out what that gap would be. And that way we can start working on teachers wanting to move up and get their 4-year degree. Because you've got a lot right now that have associates, but what is the incentive to go back to school, to move to Head Start or a public school classroom?
Right.
So why do I need to do that if I really like where I'm at?
Right.
It raises all sorts of questions, but I definitely think if we want to talk about quality, we have to change the narrative and include teachers' wages and benefits as an element of quality. If we are revising our quality rating improvement system, quality has to include the financial, physical, and well-being of the people doing the work. But again, Ashley, opinion.
And how do we get this opinion closer to reality? I guess that's
hopefully people listening. I mean, we still have open forums that are around the QRS revision. We still have, I mean, we all have free will to be able to contact legislators, decision makers, even tell somebody on the street, hey, did you know that childcare programs might close and teachers lose money? People just don't know.
And I think that's the problem here. People don't know, but it's coming. It's a cliff.
Yeah.
And we're approaching the edge of that cliff very, very rapidly.
Yeah. And I think anyone wanting to know more about it is easily right now just a Google search. So if you're hearing this and have no clue and just said, oh my gosh, that's crazy. There's a YouTube video that I'll say all you have to put in is, why does childcare cost so much and early childhood teachers earn so little? That'll come right up. It's like 3 minutes. It's a cartoon, but it explains it all super easily. You can share that. You can also go to ncleg.gov and figure out who it is that's representing you, where you live. And then you can also just put in, early childhood programs crisis, North Carolina. And you will get a lot of information about what's going on and different ways to get involved. Again, not encouraging. I'm not in a position where I'm trying to tell folks, here's what you need to go do specifically, as much as I want to advocate for you to educate yourselves on the problem that we have going on. Because whether or not you see yourself in that, I don't have young kids, it doesn't impact me. Everyone around you is going to be impacted in some way. It might be the person who now is not working to check you out at the grocery store. Or when you go up to the store at the gas station and the sign is up and says, sorry, we closed at 6 p.m. today. Those, I think we often see and we go, why aren't people working anymore? But we never take into account when these things happen. Do they have kids in their home? Because 90% of the time with staffing issues in just our public spaces, much less early childhood places, doesn't have to do with people not wanting to work. It has to do with childcare issues.
Yes, and these issues have been, in the 25 years that I've been doing this, these issues have been very prevalent, but now they're more pronounced. Mm-hmm. And we're getting to a crucial point where something's got to be done. Yeah. The stopgap, yes, short term, but long-term solutions need to be found.
Yeah, and I think that's really an important thing. So as we think about advocacy and really knowing that programs need these grants to continue, it is a both and, because the grants can solve a short-term problem, but I would hate to see all of us in the same position a year from now asking the same question. So it does need to be a both and. And I think local businesses and governments can come together to have conversations on what they might be able to do too. So just hopefully folks listening will get a bug in their ear and start thinking creatively and outside the box, because we need some fresh ideas of things that we haven't done before, because what we've done hasn't worked.
Yes, that's I can say for sure. And in my 25-year history of doing this, we definitely need to find some solutions that's going to last.
Yeah.
And I think that's all for today. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening to our first podcast, The Workforce That Supports the Workforce. And especially thank Ashley for joining us on our first podcast today.
Anytime. And thank you for focusing on the topic. It's the passion of all I do. And I keep saying, I feel like I picked up a baton from some mentors of mine that have kind of inspired me and been really just gotten passionate about this as a thing. I experienced it as a mom, both when I was pregnant with my daughter eons ago, what feels like, when I needed care and couldn't find it that was affordable. And then again, when she was like 4 or 5, and just some different experiences that drove me as a mom. And not to say this isn't a problem that's experienced across family roles, units, genders, but historically, moms end up holding a lot of the responsibility of figuring out care. And it kind of made me mad enough to say, I want to go back and do something about it. And I hope that there's other women in that position who hear it too. And instead of saying, let me figure out a solution down the street, no, because it's not fair. That's what even anti-bias curriculum that we teach young children, that's a step in that, is recognizing something that's not fair. And the social justice piece is, okay, so what do we do about it? And that's probably the biggest thing. Is I just hope folks listening hear it and say, that isn't fair. What are we going to do about it?
And I guess more times than not, when childcare can't be found, the mom misses a day at work and she's at home.
There's a huge career sacrifice in studies that show the dollar amounts of foregone wages that have to do with childcare complications for women in the workforce. But I also don't want to totally focus on that, because I feel like it's a privileged conversation compared to the people in the classrooms. It's such a twofold issue that you would say women on the outside with these career sacrifices, which really are minimal if you think about the sacrifice of the people in the classroom. So I think for me, that kind of helped me say, I can be here and do this work and speak for that problem, because it's really not fair for the people who helped raise my child.
Right.
It's hard. It is hard, but I think awareness is probably one of the first steps towards seeing that it's a problem that impacts everybody, male, female, no matter gender, role. We all are connected, and early childhood is not a private matter. It's a public good. And return on investment, Heckman, there's tons of research that's done that showed even years ago, every dollar yields $8 back. Reduced crime rates. Reduced, I could go on. I'm on my soapbox. I'll stop. We have plenty of justification for why it's important. I just hope people hear it, get that it's a problem, and pick up the baton and run with it.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much for all you do. And thanks for joining us today. And we would love to have you back on the podcast sometime in the future.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming out today. Really appreciate it.
And thanks for you doing what you're doing here too. It's important.
Well, it's my pleasure.